And this year we're proud to have Gareth Fisher. He's a graduate student at UC Berkeley. And so he's going to be talking to you about working towards conservation objectives on rangeland, global and local perspectives in the age of regulation.
While a lot of the public rangelands around the West, outside of California, and especially just outside of this Bay Area, remain under constant scrutiny and litigation for a variety of reasons, whether it's potentially degraded riparian areas for allegedly being captured by the cattle industry, or their potential damage to endangered species habitat. Mediterranean and California rangelands could be in a pretty unique position from a use standpoint, because managers and scientists and the general public are perhaps starting to come to a consensus about that a lot of measurable values can be derived from grazing animals. And that grazing animals are starting to be understood as part of the system, not necessarily only a tool or something to be managed in spite of, or managing systems to include livestock as a central piece of that. How research dollars to study these things are spread around depends on a range of factors, not insignificantly including the current political party, the desires and interests of the public, and advocacy and previous work with the scientific community, and hopefully also the needs of ranchers can determine some of this research agenda. So for anyone who is just at the Browns Valley Field Day on Tuesday, some of these specific conservation effects are beginning to have a dollar value put on them to try and figure out what ranchers can be compensated for, ranchers and potentially agencies can be compensated for in providing some of these values to society. So there's three main themes to talk about here. One is cultural cognition, and you have this on your handout, and the knowledge deficit. The second is traditional ecological knowledge, and the third is innovation and regulation. So cultural cognition and the knowledge deficit, messages are delivered in specific ways. We know this, right? And how these messages are taken up for discussion varies considerably. Part of this, the reason for this variability is something that people call that some scientists have called the knowledge deficit disorder, which just says that in this case that scientists, managers, and policymakers say that if the public just knew more, they might be able to make better decisions. They would just one day simply get it if we could just bombard them with more facts and more information. Well, we're starting to understand through also through groups like this that that's not necessarily the case. There's a lot else going on that influences how people are making decisions, and research is showing that more information is not always the answer to holding a successful public discussion about environmental issues, or in this case, rangelands. So what's this called? Social psychologists are calling this cultural cognition, which all this is saying is that we see things according to our own experiences and biases, and depending on who's delivering the message, we're more or less likely to buy into that message. So the research is showing that something called protective cognition is a major cause of the disagreements about the validity of particular information. And it's based on a lot of on the difference in people's values. And all of this is suggesting is that people are seeking to protect their own values, potentially above any serious consideration of either scientific evidence or facts or things that people are telling them. So the solution to this isn't startling, but it's worth considering in the context of conservation on rangelands. Depending on how a message is delivered to specific kinds of people, those people vary greatly in how they're going to accept the message. The author of the study on cultural cognition implies that it's all in how people hear this particular piece of evidence and how it's delivered from someone who shares their values. When it is delivered from someone who shares their values, they're much more likely to buy into it. So what does this have to do with working on conservation objectives on rangelands? You're probably thinking, and it does, or it may. The idea of cultural cognition, it can be used in some interesting ways in thinking about how rangelands are managed and promoted, and how science and management are interacting on the rangelands. Unlike a lot of broader scale environmental issues, rangelands have central stakeholders, which is ranchers and land managers, who are acting on a local scale and who are directly dependent on the productivity of the land. And they're spending a lot of their time, a lot of their days observing this interaction that Denise was talking about, and David, between factors like plants and soil and wildlife, water, livestock, and people. Their process of data collection can be pretty informal. Even if they may not be writing it down, or they may not be thinking about it in a particular metric, but whether it's measuring rainfall or counting frogs, knowing where those frogs are, using their past experience and qualitative observation to know when their cattle need to be moved. It's often called by the literature as traditional ecological knowledge. So all that is traditional ecological knowledge. Is it knowing when in the fall cattle are ready to come off the high country, is letting them drop off on their own, and then getting behind the remnants to before the first snow comes? Is it seeing a particular spring or stock pond change over time and watching a population of songbirds or frogs ebb and flow? Or is it having just a sense without data necessarily that grass is grazed sufficiently for the season and that they need to start feeding hay or moving their cattle to winter pasture? And again, none of this might ever be done with formal data collection. So perceptions of rangeland condition along these same lines can really vary strongly according to the viewer. How much something is grazed, or if the land is healthy, really how we see that sometimes can really depend on who's doing the seeing. Around California, of course it's the classic case of the stock pond. What's representing a denuded landscape to one observer might well appear healthy to another one, depending on their orientations and where they're from. As one well-respected ranch manager put it, with barely concealed euphemism, and I'll try and soften this a little, it might be wise to hammer the heck out of a riparian area with the belief that short-term grazing impact might actually lead to long-term riparian creek functionality. He might not have had the ranch manager might not have had the science to support his management decision, but he had his own empirical evidence that heavily grazing a riparian area for a brief period during the growing season could lead to long-term change. So what's interesting to hear from some ranchers that I talked with in these conversations is that after integrating a framework of quantitative analysis, and this gets to some of the ideas of traditional ecological knowledge, of knowing what's on the land, for the first time these ranchers are measuring inputs and outputs, whether they're livestock movements, labor costs, pasture rent, overhead, opportunity costs. After a lot of years of doing business by feel, they've come out with more or less the same result as before they had measured them. There's a sense with some people that how they've been managing their range and business for many years is sufficient, and it might even exceed some of the management that's being recommended by science and agencies. So they have kind of their own metrics that they're using, observational metrics. I also heard from people in these conversations who had a fair amount of frustration when it came time to implement some of their management practices, whether this was a rancher or an agency range manager. There's a sense from some people that because a rancher and an agency employee are engaged in vastly different occupations, of course, one's regulating the use of a resource and one's producing a commodity that uses that resource that's dependent on how much of that resource you can use, they can sometimes have trouble reconciling each other's goals. It's from the agency perspective, some agency managers mentioned to me that maybe ranchers might not have a sense of the scale of bureaucracy that an agency range manager is dealing with, and that decisions that the range managers make on the ground might have been constrained by the larger bureaucracy that they were working under. Some people some agency range managers just wanted to keep their jobs above anything else. A common comment from ranchers was that grazing management plans, or even more narrow conservation activities, were sometimes managed by agencies without those agencies necessarily understanding the annual cycle of cattle production, of when calves are born and sold, of the time that's required to build and maintain fences, or of the potentially practical, inexpensive, and one-off solutions that could be developed for problems that might cost tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars to implement under a bid process that many of us are probably familiar with. Some ranchers commented to me that they were willing to remain flexible to a considerable degree with their management if it meant having guaranteed access to forage on a long-term basis, so they might be willing to make some operational concessions. And many seemed pleased with their ability to work together with agency employees, and they were understood that they were managing for a lot of values other than forage production, other than cattle production, even though that's the primary business that they were in. There was an indication from people that the relationships of trust had been established over a number of years. It's taken a long time to build up, and that these were really important to maintaining stability in private business and public landowner stewardship.